Lurking in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose names you've likely never heard, yet whose crimes are so disturbing, so methodical, and so horrifying that they rival or even surpass the most infamous murderers in human history. Today, we're diving deep into the twisted minds and unspeakable acts of 5 serial killers who somehow slip through the cracks of public consciousness. These aren't your typical true crime subjects. These are the forgotten monsters, the ones whose stories were buried by time, geography, or sheer disbelief at what human beings are capable of doing to one another. We're talking about Gordon Stewart Northcott, a Canadian predator who turned a California chicken ranch into a house of horrors for young boys. Nathaniel Bar Jonah, whose coded journals contained recipes for cooking children. Wayne Adam Ford, a long-haul trucker who walked into a police station carrying a severed breast in his jacket pocket. Francisco de Assis Pereira, who terrorized the women of São Paulo while masquerading as a helpful motorcycle courier. And Lam Kor Wan, Hong Kong's first recorded serial killer, whose apartment contained jars filled with human organs preserved in formaldehyde. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how they operated in plain sight, how they exploited trust and vulnerability, and how close they came to claiming even more victims before they were finally stopped. Some of these killers confessed to murders that authorities still can't verify. Others took secrets to their graves that may never be uncovered. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how ordinary these men appeared to those around them. They weren't the wild-eyed maniacs of horror movies. They were quiet neighbors, helpful co-workers, even trusted community members. They understood that the best camouflage for a monster is the mask of normalcy. Let's begin with Gordon Stewart Northcott, whose story starts in the dusty farmlands of 1920s California, where the American dream was about to become an unimaginable nightmare for dozens of innocent children. Gordon Stewart Northcott was born on November 9th, 1906, in the small farming community of Bladworth, Saskatchewan, Canada. From the outside, his early life appeared unremarkable, the kind of rural Canadian upbringing that should have produced a hard-working farmer or tradesman. But even as a child, there were signs that something was fundamentally wrong with Gordon Northcott. He was prone to violent outbursts, showed little empathy for others, and displayed an unsettling fascination with control and domination that would only grow more twisted with age. In 1924, when Gordon was 18, his family made the decision that would set the stage for one of America's most horrific crime sprees. They packed up their belongings and moved south to Los Angeles, California, drawn by the promise of opportunity and prosperity that California represented to so many families during the 1920s. But for the Northcott family, this move would bring something far darker than the American dream. Gordon's mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, was not the typical protective maternal figure you might expect. Instead, she was a domineering, manipulative woman who seemed to exercise an almost hypnotic control over her son. Some who knew the family later described their relationship as unnaturally close, bordering on inappropriate. Sarah Louise appeared to encourage Gordon's worst impulses rather than correcting them, creating a toxic dynamic that would prove deadly for the innocent children who would later cross their path. After spending some time in Los Angeles, Gordon decided to establish his own operation. He purchased a chicken ranch in the small, isolated community of Wineville, California, about 50 miles east of Los Angeles. Wineville was the perfect location for someone with dark intentions. It was rural, sparsely populated, and far enough from the city that screams wouldn't be heard and visitors were rare. The chicken ranch gave Gordon the perfect cover story, a legitimate business that explained his presence in the area while providing him with the privacy he needed for his true activities. But Gordon Northcott wasn't interested in raising chickens. He was interested in something far more sinister. He began using his ranch as a front for luring young boys, promising them work, shelter, and steady pay. During the Great Depression era, when families were struggling and children were often sent out to find work wherever they could, Gordon's offer seemed like a godsend to desperate parents and runaway children. What these boys found when they arrived at the Wineville Chicken Ranch was not honest work, but a nightmare beyond their worst fears. Gordon would imprison the children, subjecting them to horrific sexual abuse, torture, and psychological torment. He wasn't working alone in these atrocities. His mother, Sarah Louise, was a willing participant, helping to control the children and cover up the crimes. Even more disturbing, Gordon had forced his own nephew, a boy named Sanford Clark, to participate in the abuse and murders. Sanford Clark had been sent to live with his uncle Gordon by his parents, who thought they were giving their son an opportunity for a better life in America. Instead, Sanford became both a victim and an unwilling accomplice to Gordon's crimes. Under constant threat of death, Sanford was forced to help lure other children to the ranch and even participate in their murders. The psychological trauma inflicted on this young boy was immeasurable, and his testimony would later prove crucial in bringing Gordon Northcott to justice. The exact number of Gordon Northcott's victims may never be known. He confessed to killing 9 children, was convicted of murdering 3, but investigators suspected the true number could be as high as 20 or more. The children ranged in age from just 5 years old to teenagers, all of them vulnerable, all of them trusting enough to believe Gordon's promises of work and safety. Gordon's method of killing was particularly brutal. He would often use an axe to murder the children, sometimes forcing other victims to watch as a form of psychological torture. After the murders, he would dispose of the bodies in various ways, sometimes burying them on the ranch property, other times using quicklime to destroy the evidence, or even dismembering the corpses and scattering the remains across the California desert. The case that would eventually bring Gordon Northcott's crimes to light involved the disappearance of 9-year-old Walter Collins in March 1928. Walter had left his home in Los Angeles to go to the movies and simply vanished. His mother, Christine Collins, refused to give up searching for her son, and her relentless pursuit of answers would eventually expose the full horror of what was happening at the Wineville Chicken Ranch. The investigation began to unravel Gordon's operation when his nephew Sanford Clark managed to escape and confide in his sister about the horrors he had witnessed and been forced to participate in. Sanford's testimony was devastating. He described in detail how Gordon would lure children to the ranch, the sexual abuse they endured, and the brutal murders that followed. He told investigators about the shallow graves scattered around the property and the quicklime used to destroy evidence. When police finally searched the Wineville Chicken Ranch, they found a scene that defied belief. Human bones and remains were discovered buried beneath the chicken coops. Surgical instruments and other evidence of torture were found throughout the property. The ranch that had appeared to be a legitimate business was revealed to be a carefully constructed killing ground. Gordon Northcott and his mother, Sarah Louise, attempted to flee to Canada when they realized the investigation was closing in on them, but they were apprehended in September 1928. The extradition process was complicated by the fact that Gordon was a Canadian citizen, but eventually both mother and son were returned to California to face justice. During the legal proceedings, both Gordon and his mother initially confessed to various murders, including that of Walter Collins, but later recanted their confessions. The trial, which took place in Riverside County, California, in early 1929, lasted 27 days and revealed disturbing details about the systematic abuse and murder of children. The evidence against Gordon was overwhelming, including Sanford Clark's testimony, the physical evidence found at the ranch, and the confessions he had made before recanting. On February 13, 1929, Gordon Stewart Northcott was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to death. His execution took place on October 2, 1930, at San Quentin State Prison. He was just 23 years old. The execution itself was reportedly gruesome, with the rope failing to break his neck properly, leading to a prolonged death by strangulation that lasted 13 agonizing minutes. Sarah Louise Northcott was also convicted for her role in the murders, including the killing of Walter Collins, and received a life sentence. She was eventually paroled in 1940 and died in 1944. The horrific nature of the Wineville chicken coop murders was so traumatic for the local community that the town of Wineville actually changed its name to Mira Loma in an attempt to distance itself from the infamous crimes. The case remains one of the most disturbing examples of child murder in American history, not just because of the number of victims, but because of the systematic nature of the abuse and the fact that it was carried out by people who should have been protectors rather than predators. The second monster on our list operated far from the dusty ranches of California, but his crimes were equally horrifying. In the industrial city of Great Falls, Montana, children began disappearing in the 1990s. Parents locked their doors earlier. School pickup lines grew longer. The community was gripped by fear, but no one suspected that the danger came from a man who positioned himself as a protector of children. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah was born David Paul Brown on February 15, 1957, in Worcester, Massachusetts. From the outside, he appeared to be just another troubled kid from a working-class family. But beneath that ordinary exterior lurked something monstrous. His descent into darkness began early, and the warning signs were impossible to ignore. At 17, Bar-Jonah committed his first recorded crime, and it revealed the twisted fantasy that would define his entire life. He posed as a police officer, luring an 8-year-old boy into his car with the promise of help. Once the child was trapped, Bar-Jonah beat and choked him nearly to death. The boy survived, but Bar-Jonah received only a year of probation. That slap on the wrist would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. The leniency shown to Bar-Jonah emboldened him. In 1977, he escalated his crimes dramatically. Again posing as a police officer, he abducted 2 boys in Massachusetts. His method was calculated and terrifying. He would flash fake credentials, order the children into his vehicle, and drive them to isolated locations where he could act out his darkest impulses without interruption. During this attack, Bar Jonah strangled one child so violently that he believed the boy was dead. Satisfied with his work, he drove away with the second victim still alive in his trunk. What he didn't know was that the first child had survived. That boy managed to crawl to safety and alert authorities, leading to Bar Jonah's arrest and the rescue of the second victim. While incarcerated, Bar Jonah underwent psychiatric evaluation, and what emerged from those sessions was beyond disturbing. He openly described his fantasies to mental health professionals, detailing elaborate scenarios of abducting children, torturing them, murdering them, and then dismembering and eating their remains. These weren't fleeting thoughts or moments of madness. They were detailed, methodical plans that he had been nurturing for years. The psychiatrist documented everything. Bar Jonah spoke of his desire to consume human flesh, particularly that of children. He described how he would prepare the bodies, what cooking methods he would use, and how he would dispose of the evidence. He talked about these horrific acts with the same casual tone most people use to discuss their dinner plans. Despite these chilling revelations, the justice system failed spectacularly. In 1991, a judge reviewed Bar Jonah's case and made a decision that would haunt multiple families forever. The judge determined that Bar Jonah was not a dangerous threat to society and ordered his release. This wasn't a case of insufficient evidence or legal technicalities. The man had confessed to wanting to kill and eat children, and he was still set free. Upon his release, Bar Jonah immediately began planning his new life. He legally changed his name from David Paul Brown to Nathaniel Benjamin Levi Bar Jonah, creating a fresh identity that would allow him to move freely without the baggage of his criminal past. He relocated to Montana, specifically choosing a small community where he could blend in and where his history might not follow him. Bar Jonah's choice of Montana was strategic. In Great Falls, he quickly integrated himself into the community, particularly targeting Christian Fellowship youth groups. He volunteered his time, presented himself as a devout man of faith, and gained the trust of parents who were grateful for his apparent dedication to their children. He was manipulative, charming when necessary, and patient enough to build relationships that would give him access to potential victims. The community embraced him. Bar Jonah was seen as a helpful neighbor, a man who cared about children and wanted to make a positive difference in their lives. Parents would leave their children in his care, invite him to family gatherings, and consider him a trusted friend. They had no idea they were welcoming a predator into their homes. For years, Bar Jonah operated in plain sight. He attended church services, participated in community events, and maintained the facade of a reformed man who had found purpose in helping others. But behind closed doors, he was meticulously planning his next moves. He studied the routines of local families, identified children who might be vulnerable, and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. The facade began to crumble in December 1999. Police received reports of suspicious activity involving Bar Jonah and local children. When they obtained a search warrant for his home, what they discovered was beyond their worst nightmares. The house was filled with thousands of photographs of children, all carefully cut from magazines and organized in disturbing ways. But that was just the beginning. Hidden in Bar Jonah's residence was a journal written in an elaborate code. The FBI was called in to decipher the cryptic writing, and what they found made seasoned investigators physically ill. The journal contained detailed descriptions of torturing, killing, and eating children. It wasn't fiction or fantasy. These were methodical plans, complete with recipes for preparing human flesh. Bar Jonah had written step-by-step instructions for dismembering small bodies, which cuts of meat would be most tender, and how to season human flesh to make it palatable. He had turned the murder and consumption of children into a twisted culinary art form. Investigators also found a piece of human bone in Bar Jonah's garage. The bone was small, consistent with that of a child, and it had been cleanly cut, suggesting it had been removed with surgical precision. This physical evidence transformed the case from suspected kidnapping and assault to potential murder and cannibalism. The investigation centered on the disappearance of 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey, who had vanished in 1996. Zachary was last seen walking home from school when he simply disappeared without a trace. His backpack, his clothes, his body, everything was gone. The police had conducted extensive searches, interviewed hundreds of people, and followed every lead, but Zachary had seemingly vanished into thin air. Bar Jonah became the prime suspect in Zachary's disappearance. The timeline matched, the location was consistent with Bar Jonah's movements, and the coded journal contained references that investigators believed were connected to Zachary's murder. Prosecutors were convinced they had found Zachary's killer, and they prepared to seek the death penalty. The case took a disturbing turn when investigators began questioning Bar Jonah's neighbors about his behavior. He claimed to be an experienced hunter and would proudly serve large quantities of meat that he said came from deer he had killed himself. Multiple neighbors remarked that the meat had an unusual taste. It was gamey, they said, but different from any venison they had eaten before. Some described it as having a strange texture, almost like pork, but not quite right. Bar Jonah would watch intently as people ate, asking repeatedly if they enjoyed the flavor and if they wanted more. The implications were horrifying. Investigators began to suspect that Bar Jonah had not only murdered Zachary Ramsey, but had also butchered his body, cooked his flesh, and served it to unsuspecting neighbors at community gatherings. The thought that innocent families had unknowingly consumed human flesh was almost too disturbing to process. Bar Jonah was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and the murder of Zachary Ramsey. The prosecution built their case around the physical evidence, the coded journal, and the pattern of behavior that stretched back to Bar Jonah's crimes in Massachusetts. They argued that he was a dangerous predator who had been escalating his violence for decades and had finally acted on his cannibalistic fantasies. However, the case took an unexpected turn during the trial. Zachary's mother, Rachel Ramsey, testified that she did not believe Bar Jonah had killed her son. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, despite the journal entries and the bone fragment, she felt that the real killer was still out there. Her testimony created reasonable doubt, and the murder charges were eventually dropped. Bar Jonah was ultimately convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, aggravated assault, and sexual assault of children. He was sentenced to 130 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that he would never again have the opportunity to harm a child, but it also meant that the truth about what happened to Zachary Ramsey might never be known. On April 13th, 2008, Nathaniel Bar Jonah died in his cell at Montana State Prison. He was 51 years old and had been serving his sentence for less than a decade. The official cause of death was cardiovascular disease, exacerbated by his morbid obesity. He had gained hundreds of pounds in prison, eating compulsively and refusing to participate in physical activity. Bar Jonah's death left many questions unanswered. The coded journal contained references to multiple victims, suggesting that Zachary Ramsey may not have been his only victim. Investigators found mentions of other children, other disappearances, and other recipes that had never been connected to specific cases. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. The case exposed serious flaws in the justice system and highlighted the dangers of releasing violent predators back into society. Bar Jonah had been evaluated by mental health professionals who documented his desire to kill and eat children, yet he was still deemed safe for release. That decision cost at least one child his life and traumatized an entire community. For the families of missing children in Massachusetts, Wyoming, and Montana, Bar Jonah's death brought no closure. They were left to wonder if their loved ones had fallen victim to his twisted fantasies, if their remains had been consumed and destroyed, leaving no trace behind. The thought that their children might have suffered such a horrific fate was almost unbearable. The Nathaniel Bar Jonah case remains one of the most disturbing examples of how a predator can hide in plain sight, using community trust and religious faith as cover for unspeakable acts. As we delve deeper into the twisted minds of killers you've never heard of, we encounter Wayne Adam Ford, a man whose final act of surrender would reveal one of the most disturbing crime sprees in California history. Picture this. November 3rd, 1998, Humboldt County Sheriff's Department. The evening shift was winding down when a tall, bearded man in his late 30s walked through the front doors. He approached the desk sergeant calmly, almost casually, and said he needed to confess to murder. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a severed human breast wrapped in plastic. That man was Wayne Adam Ford, and what he revealed next would uncover a trail of mutilated bodies scattered across California's highways and waterways. For over a year, Ford had been living a double life. By day, he was a long-haul truck driver, a former Marine who seemed ordinary enough to blend into any truck stop or diner. By night, he transformed into something else entirely, a predator who used America's vast highway system as his hunting ground. Ford's killing spree began in 1997, targeting the most vulnerable women he could find: sex workers, hitchhikers, women desperate enough to accept rides from strangers. He knew exactly who to choose, women society often overlooked, women whose disappearances might not make headlines. Thus, his method was brutally efficient: strangulation, followed by dismemberment, then disposal in remote locations where bodies might never be found. The first confirmed victim was Carrie Ann Cummings, a 25-year-old woman whose dismembered remains were discovered floating in Ryan Slough near Humboldt Bay in October '97. For 25 years, Carrie remained nameless, known only as Jane Doe, until advanced DNA technology finally identified her in 2023. But Carrie was just the beginning of Ford's horrific rampage. In May 1998, Ford killed Tina Renee Gibbs, that's near Las Vegas. The 26-year-old's body was found in Buttonwillow, California, her remains scattered like refuse along the highway. Then came Lynette Dayon White, 25, murdered in Ontario, California in September 1908, her body dumped near Lodi. Finally, Patricia Ann Tamez, 29, killed in Hesperia, her corpse discovered in a San Bernardino aqueduct in October 1998. Each murder followed the same chilling pattern. Ford would pick up his victims during late-night hours, often from dark street corners or isolated truck stops. He targeted women who were alone, desperate, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Once they were in his truck, there was no escape. He would drive to secluded areas where he could kill without interruption, taking his time with each victim. What made Ford particularly terrifying was his methodical approach to body disposal. He didn't just kill and dump. He carefully dismembered his victims, scattering body parts across multiple locations to make identification difficult. Some remains were thrown into waterways, others buried in shallow graves, and some were simply left for scavengers in remote desert locations. He treated human beings like garbage, disposing of them with the same casual indifference one might show when throwing away trash. During his 3-month trial, prosecutors described Ford as a monster who devoured vulnerable women to satisfy his sexually sadistic appetite. The evidence painted a picture of calculated brutality that went far beyond simple murder. One survivor's testimony revealed the true horror of Ford's methods. She described how he bound her, raped her, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Miraculously, she survived when Ford apparently believed she was dead and inexplicably released her. Her account revealed that Ford's attacks weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned exercises in sexual sadism. He derived pleasure not just from killing, but from the process of domination, torture, and degradation. The infliction of pain and terror was as important to him as the final act of murder. He would prolong his victims' suffering, savoring their fear and helplessness before finally ending their lives. What drove Ford to surrender remains one of the most puzzling aspects of his case. According to reports, his brother encouraged him to turn himself in, but Ford's own motivations seemed to stem from a recognition that he couldn't stop killing. In a twisted moment of self-awareness, he realized he was compelled to continue murdering and chose to remove himself from society rather than claim more victims. The severed breast he carried into the sheriff's department belonged to his final victim, a grisly trophy that demonstrated the complete dehumanization of his victims in his mind. They weren't people to him. They were objects to be used, destroyed, and discarded. The fact that he carried a piece of human flesh so casually speaks to the complete erosion of his humanity. Ford's background revealed troubling warning signs that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of a developing killer. As a former Marine, he had military training that taught him discipline and precision, skills he later applied to murder. He suffered a severe head injury that reportedly worsened pre-existing emotional problems, making him unable to control what he described as dark sexual impulses. This combination of training, brain damage, and psychological dysfunction created a perfect storm of violence. His choice of profession as a long-haul trucker provided the perfect cover for his crimes. The trucking industry allowed him to travel vast distances, giving him access to victims across multiple states while providing plausible explanations for his whereabouts. Highway rest stops, truck stops, and the transient nature of trucking culture meant he could pick up victims in one location and dispose of them hundreds of miles away. On June 27, 2006, Wayne Adam Ford was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and currently sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. The investigation revealed that Ford likely had more victims than the 4 he was convicted of killing. His travels as a trucker took him across the western United States, and authorities believe there may be additional victims whose bodies were never found or whose cases were never connected to him. The Wayne Adam Ford case highlights the particular vulnerability of society's most marginalized individuals. His victims were women who existed on the fringes, women whose disappearances didn't trigger massive manhunts or generate significant media attention. This invisibility made them perfect targets for a predator who understood that society's indifference to certain populations could provide him with a steady stream of victims. Ford's story also demonstrates how modern transportation systems can be exploited by serial killers. The interstate highway system, designed to connect communities and facilitate commerce, became a tool for murder. The same roads that brought prosperity and connection to American communities also allowed predators like Ford to hunt across vast territories, making detection and capture exponentially more difficult. His case remains a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Ford looked like countless other truck drivers who crisscross America's highways every day. He could stop for coffee at any diner, fuel up at any truck stop, and engage in casual conversation without raising the slightest suspicion. This ability to blend in, to appear completely normal, made him all the more dangerous. The psychological profile that emerged during Ford's trial revealed a man who was simultaneously aware of his compulsions and unable to control them. This internal conflict between his recognition that his actions were wrong and his inability to stop himself created a unique form of psychological torture. In a sense, Ford was both perpetrator and victim of his own diseased mind, though this in no way diminishes the horror of his crimes or the suffering of his victims. Today, Wayne Adam Ford remains on death row, his execution date uncertain due to California's complex legal processes surrounding capital punishment. His victims, however, achieved a form of justice through his conviction, and their families finally received answers about their loved ones' fates. Now we turn to Wayne Adam Ford, a name that should make your skin crawl. Ford was a long-haul truck driver who turned the highways of California into his personal hunting ground. Between 1997 and 1998, he stalked, murdered, and dismembered vulnerable women across the state, scattering their remains like roadside trash. But what makes Ford's case truly chilling isn't just the brutality of his crimes, it's how he ended his killing spree. In November 1908, Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department with something horrifying in his jacket pocket, a woman's severed breast. He calmly placed it on the desk and confessed to murdering 4 women. Wayne Adam Ford was born on December 3, 1961, into what appeared to be an ordinary American family. He served as a Marine, married, had children, and seemed to be living a normal life. But beneath this facade of normalcy lurked something deeply twisted. Ford suffered a severe head injury during his military service, an injury that would later be cited as worsening pre-existing emotional problems and making him unable to control his darkest sexual impulses. After his military discharge, Ford became a long-haul trucker, a profession that would give him the perfect cover for his crimes. The highways of America are filled with vulnerable people, runaways, sex workers, women desperate enough to accept rides from strangers. Ford knew this, and he exploited it ruthlessly. His victims were women society often overlooked, women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger massive search efforts. Ford targeted them specifically because he knew they were less likely to be missed quickly, if at all. He would cruise truck stops, roadside diners, and dark stretches of highway looking for women who were alone, desperate, or in need of help. Ford's first identified victim was Carrie Ann Cummings, a 25-year-old woman whose dismembered body was discovered in Ryan Slough near Humboldt Bay on October 17, 1997. For 25 years, Cummings remained a Jane Doe, her identity lost to time and bureaucracy. It wasn't until June 2023 that advanced forensic DNA testing and genealogical matching finally identified her, bringing a measure of closure to her case decades after her brutal murder. The fact that it took so long to identify her speaks to Ford's calculated targeting of society's most vulnerable members. His method was sickeningly consistent. Ford would approach women under the guise of offering help or a ride. Once they were in his truck, isolated and vulnerable, he would reveal his true nature. He would bind them, rape them, and then strangle them to death. But Ford's depravity didn't end with murder. He would then dismember their bodies with clinical precision, scattering the remains across California's waterways to make identification difficult and to cover his tracks. Tina Renee Gibbs, on 26, became Ford's next victim in May 1998. He killed her near Las Vegas, then transported her dismembered remains to Buttonwillow, California, where they were discovered. The geographic spread of the crime scenes demonstrates Ford's calculating nature. He wasn't killing in a frenzy. He was methodically planning each murder, each disposal, each attempt to evade capture. In September 1998, Ford murdered Lynette Deon White, 25, in Ontario, California. Her body was found dumped near Lodi, once again far from where she was killed. Ford was creating a web of crime scenes across the state, making it difficult for law enforcement to connect the dots and recognize they were dealing with a serial killer. Each victim was found in a different jurisdiction, each investigation initially treated as an isolated incident. Patricia Ann Temez, 29, became Ford's final victim in October 1998. He killed her in Hesperia, California, then dumped her body in an aqueduct in San Bernardino. By this point, Ford had perfected his method of murder and disposal, but something inside him was beginning to crack. The psychological pressure of his crimes was mounting, and his ability to compartmentalize his actions was failing. What makes Ford's case particularly disturbing is the testimony of a survivor. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence from a woman who had encountered Ford and lived to tell about it. She detailed how Ford had bound, raped, and strangled her, bringing her to the very edge of death. Then, inexplicably, he revived her and let her go. Her testimony revealed the calculated nature of Ford's attacks and confirmed his sexually sadistic motivations. Ford wasn't just killing for the sake of killing. He was aroused by the infliction of pain and suffering. The act of watching his victims die was a source of sexual gratification for him. This survivor's account also revealed something else crucial about Ford's psychology. He was capable of stopping himself, of pulling back from the brink. This suggests that his other murders were deliberate choices not uncontrollable impulses. He could have spared his victims, but he chose not to. He chose to watch them die because it satisfied something dark and twisted inside him. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ford's case is what happened next. In November 1998, reportedly at the urging of his brother, Ford made a decision that shocked law enforcement. He drove to the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department, walked through the front doors, and approached the desk sergeant. Without any explanation, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a woman's severed breast, placing it on the desk like it was the most natural thing in the world. The desk sergeant stared in horror as Ford calmly announced that he had killed 4 women. He provided details about their murders, locations where remains could be found, and a confession that would make seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. Ford explained that he had been carrying the severed breast around for days, unable to dispose of it, unable to continue his normal life with this macabre trophy in his possession. Ford's self-surrender raises disturbing questions about his mental state and motivations. Was this an act of conscience, a moment of clarity where he realized the horror of what he had done? Or was it something more calculating, a recognition that he was losing control and that capture was inevitable? Ford himself claimed that he turned himself in because he was afraid he would kill again, that he could no longer control his urges without external intervention. During his 3-month trial in San Bernardino County Superior Court, prosecutors painted Ford as a monster who had devoured these vulnerable young women to satisfy his sexually sadistic appetite. They described how he had scattered their bodies like trash throughout the state, showing no regard for their humanity or the families who loved them. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked Ford to multiple victims, and his own confession provided details that only the killer could have known. The defense attempted to use Ford's head injury and military service as mitigating factors, arguing that his brain damage had made him unable to control his dark impulses. They painted a picture of a man struggling with psychological demons, a victim of his own damaged mind. But the prosecution countered that Ford's methodical approach to murder, his careful disposal of evidence, and his ability to function normally between killings proved that he knew exactly what he was doing. On June 27, 2006, Wayne Adam Ford was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury rejected the defense's arguments about diminished capacity and mental illness. They saw Ford for what he was, a calculating predator who had deliberately chosen to end the lives of 4 innocent women for his own twisted gratification. In August 2006, Ford was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remains on death row today. The man who once terrorized California's highways now spends his days in a small cell, waiting for an execution that may never come. California's death penalty system is notoriously slow, with many inmates spending decades on death row before their sentences are carried out. But Ford's conviction doesn't answer all the questions surrounding his case. Investigators believe he may have killed more women than the 4 he was convicted of murdering. The nature of his work as a long-haul trucker means he traveled extensively throughout the western United States, potentially encountering and killing additional victims whose remains have never been found or whose murders have never been connected to him. The case also highlights the vulnerability of women who live on society's margins. Ford's victims were all women who, for various reasons, found themselves in desperate situations where accepting help from a stranger seemed like their best option. They were women who were failed by the systems meant to protect them, women whose disappearances didn't immediately trigger massive search efforts because society had already written them off. Ford's method of targeting these vulnerable women reveals a level of calculation that makes his crimes even more heinous. He didn't encounter these women by chance. He sought them out specifically because he knew they were less likely to be missed quickly. He understood that their marginalized status in society would give him more time to commit his crimes and dispose of evidence before anyone started looking for them. The psychological profile that emerged during Ford's trial painted a picture of a man who was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Unlike killers who claim to be driven by uncontrollable urges or voices in their heads, Ford demonstrated clear planning and forethought in his crimes. He chose his victims carefully, planned his attacks methodically, and disposed of evidence in ways designed to avoid detection. This level of premeditation makes Ford's eventual surrender even more puzzling. If he was capable of such calculated behavior, why did he ultimately turn himself in? Some experts believe that the psychological pressure of maintaining his double life became unbearable. Living with the knowledge of what he had done, carrying around pieces of his victims, may have created a mental strain that even his damaged psyche couldn't handle. Others suggest that Ford's surrender was itself a calculated move, an attempt to control the narrative of his capture and maintain some sense of power, even as his world collapsed around him. By turning himself in on his own terms, Ford ensured that he would be remembered not just as a caught killer, but as someone who had voluntarily ended his own reign of terror. The Wayne Adam Ford case serves as a chilling reminder of how monsters can hide in plain sight, using ordinary professions and everyday interactions to mask their true nature. Ford wasn't a reclusive loner living in isolation. He was a working man with a family, someone who interacted with hundreds of people in the course of his job. Yet none of his colleagues, friends, or acquaintances suspected that he was capable of such horrific acts. This case also demonstrates the importance of looking beyond jurisdictional boundaries when investigating violent crimes. Ford's victims were found across multiple counties and jurisdictions, making it difficult for individual law enforcement agencies to recognize the pattern. The fourth killer on our list takes us to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where a motorcycle courier used his job as the perfect cover for hunting women. Francisco de Assis Pereira seemed like countless other delivery drivers weaving through the chaotic streets of South America's largest city. He was polite, reliable, and forgettable. Born on November 29, 1967, Francisco grew up in Sao Paulo's sprawling urban maze. His childhood was marked by trauma that would later manifest in horrifying ways. He was sexually abused by his aunt, developing what psychiatrists would later describe as a disturbing fixation on women's bodies. The abuse didn't end there. As a teenager, he was forced into homosexual relationships that left him with deep psychological scars and an irrational fear of losing his masculinity. These experiences created a volatile mix of rage, sexual confusion, and violent fantasies that would eventually explode into reality. By the late 1990s, Francisco had found work as a motoboy, one of the thousands of motorcycle couriers who navigates Sao Paulo's gridlocked streets, delivering everything from documents to food. It was the perfect job for someone who wanted to remain invisible while having access to potential victims. He could approach women on the street, offer them rides, and disappear into traffic without anyone thinking twice. The motorcycle became his weapon of choice, not for the machine itself, but for the opportunities it provided. Francisco's hunting ground was the state park, known locally as Parque do Estado, a massive 550-hectare forest reserve on Sao Paulo's southern border. This sprawling wilderness, with its dense trees and isolated trails, provided the perfect setting for his crimes. He would cruise the streets on his motorcycle, looking for young women who appeared vulnerable or desperate. His approach was always the same, friendly and helpful, offering rides or assistance with a warm smile that masked his true intentions. Once he lured his victims into the park, Francisco transformed. He would strangle his victims with his bare hands, watching the life drain from their eyes. But death wasn't enough for Francisco. His crimes included acts so depraved that even hardened investigators struggled to process them. He would sexually assault the bodies after death, and in some cases, bite off pieces of his victims' genitalia in a grotesque display of sexual violence. The first signs that a serial killer was operating in Sao Paulo came in July 1998, when 4 naked female bodies were discovered in the state park over just 3 days. All were found lying face down, with their legs spread, positioned in a way that suggested ritual or signature behavior. The victims were young women, most in their teens or early 20s, who had simply vanished from the streets of Sao Paulo without a trace. One of the first identified victims was 18-year-old Selma Ferreira Queiroz, a promising basketball player whose life was cut short by Francisco's violence. Selma's case would prove crucial to the investigation. Her partially burned ID card was found in a clogged toilet at Francisco's workplace, providing the first concrete link between the killer and his victims. This discovery opened the floodgates for investigators, who began piecing together a pattern of disappearances that stretched back months. Francisco confessed to raping and killing at least 9 women, though he admitted he may have lost count of his victims. Some sources attribute 11 murders to him, but the true number may never be known. Beyond the murders, he assaulted at least 9 other women who somehow managed to escape his clutches. These survivors provided crucial testimony about his methods and his disturbing behavior during attacks. What made Francisco particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his crimes. During the day, he was Francisco the courier, delivering packages and making small talk with customers. But when darkness fell, he became the park maniac, prowling the streets for victims. He later told psychiatrists that he had 2 personalities, a good one and a bad one, and that he prayed regularly but couldn't resist his dark urges. In a twisted display of self-awareness, he claimed he wished his victims would fight back or run away, as if their resistance might somehow save them from his compulsions. The investigation intensified as more bodies were discovered, and the media began reporting on Sao Paulo's serial killer. Francisco's image was broadcast across Brazil as police launched a massive manhunt. Despite the publicity, he managed to evade capture for weeks, even passing through several police checkpoints as he fled toward the Brazilian border with Uruguay. His downfall came through an unlikely source: While hiding out near the border, Francisco stayed with a local fisherman who recognized him from television reports. The fisherman contacted authorities, and on August 4th, 1998, Francisco de Asi Pereira was finally arrested. He didn't resist capture, perhaps knowing that his reign of terror had finally come to an end. During his interrogation, Francisco displayed the same chilling calmness that had allowed him to kill without detection for so long. He confessed to his crimes with disturbing matter-of-factness, even leading police to the remains of another victim, Isadora Frankel. Her skeleton, partially covered and burned with gasoline, was found exactly where Francisco said it would be. The confession tapes revealed a man struggling with internal demons he couldn't control. Francisco spoke of his crimes as if they were committed by someone else, referring to his bad personality as a separate entity. He described feeling compelled to kill, driven by urges he claimed to hate but couldn't resist. The psychological evaluation painted a picture of a man whose childhood trauma had created a monster that emerged when triggered by opportunity and isolation. Francisco's trial became a media sensation in Brazil, raising uncomfortable questions about journalistic ethics and sensationalism. One magazine controversially featured his confession on its cover, sparking debates about whether giving platforms to killers' words glorified their crimes or served the public interest. In the end, Francisco de Asi Pereira was sentenced to 268 years in prison for his crimes. The sentence reflected not just the number of victims, but the particular cruelty and depravity of his methods. He remains incarcerated to this day, a reminder of how ordinary evil can appear and how devastating the consequences can be when society's most vulnerable members become targets. The case exposed significant flaws in Brazil's investigative procedures at the time. Initial mistakes by police allowed Francisco to continue killing when he might have been caught earlier. The scattered nature of his crimes across São Paulo's vast urban landscape made it difficult to establish patterns until multiple bodies were discovered in the same location. Lam Korwan holds the grim distinction of being Hong Kong's first recorded serial killer, and his crimes were so shocking they changed how the territory viewed public safety forever. Born Lam Kwok Yue on May 22, 1955, he seemed destined for an unremarkable life in Hong Kong's crowded urban landscape. Like millions of others, he lived with his family in a cramped apartment, worked a blue-collar job, and blended into the background of one of the world's most densely populated cities. But Lam harbored fantasies that would make him one of Asia's most notorious killers. Working as a night shift taxi driver gave Lam the perfect cover for his crimes. Hong Kong's streets never truly sleep, and taxi drivers are part of the invisible infrastructure that keeps the city moving. Late at night, when most people are heading home from work or entertainment, taxi drivers see everyone at their most vulnerable. Passengers slide into the back seat, trusting that the person behind the wheel will get them home safely. For Lam's victims, that trust proved fatal. His victims were all young women, ranging in age from 17 to 31. Chan Fung Lan, 22 years old, Chan Wan Kit, 31, Leong Sao Wan, 29, and Leong Wai Sum, just 17 years old. They were daughters, sisters, friends who simply needed a ride home on what would become the last night of their lives. Rain in Hong Kong can be torrential, turning the streets into rivers and making taxi rides not just convenient, but necessary. During these storms, Lam would prowl the streets looking for women desperate enough to flag down his cab. Once they were inside, He would strangle them with electrical cord, often while still driving through the city's neon-lit streets. What happened next was even more disturbing. After killing his victims, Lam would drive their bodies back to his family apartment in To Kwa Wan, where his parents and younger brother lived, completely unaware of what was happening under their own roof. His night shift schedule meant he returned home when everyone else was sleeping, giving him privacy to commit acts that defied comprehension. In the apartment he shared with his unsuspecting family, Lam would engage in necrophilia with his victims' bodies. But his depravity didn't end there. He meticulously dismembered each corpse using an electric saw and surgical scalpels, treating the process like a medical procedure. What made Lam's crimes particularly chilling was his methodical documentation of everything he did. He photographed every stage of his crimes, from the initial murders to the final dismemberment. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence, but carefully planned and documented atrocities that he treated like scientific experiments. The nickname the Jar's Murderer came from perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his crimes. Lam preserved his victims' sexual organs in Tupperware containers filled with formaldehyde, hiding them throughout his apartment like grotesque trophies. He treated these body parts like specimens, maintaining them with the same care a researcher might preserve laboratory samples. For months, Hong Kong police were baffled by the appearance of female body parts in various locations around the city. The first discoveries came in February 1982, when dismembered remains began surfacing in different areas. Without modern forensic techniques, investigators struggled to connect the scattered evidence or identify a suspect. Lam's downfall came through an unlikely source, a photo technician at a Kodak shop. In his arrogance, Lam had attempted to develop some of his crime scene photographs at a commercial photo lab. The technician, horrified by what he saw in the images, immediately contacted police. This tip, combined with the ongoing investigation into the body parts discoveries, finally gave investigators the lead they needed. On August 17, 1982, police raided Lam's family apartment. What they found inside defied imagination. Surgical equipment, thousands of photographs documenting his crimes, video recordings of necrophilia and dismemberment, and the preserved body parts of his victims stored in containers throughout the home. His family members, who had been living mere feet away from this house of horrors, were as shocked as the investigators. During his trial, even more disturbing details emerged. Lam confessed to a psychiatrist that he had eaten part of one victim's intestine, claiming his actions weren't driven by sexual lust, but by an obsession with female anatomy. In a particularly chilling statement, he said that God told him to kill the victims, suggesting either genuine delusion or a calculated attempt to appear insane. The psychological evaluation revealed a man whose crimes were driven by a complex mixture of sexual fantasy, power, and what appeared to be a scientific curiosity about death and the human body. Unlike killers motivated by rage or opportunism, Lam's crimes showed signs of careful planning and ritualistic behavior that suggested deeper psychological disturbance. In 1983, Lam Kor Wan was sentenced to death for the murder of 4 women. However, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole by Hong Kong's governor in 1984. He remains incarcerated today, nearly 4 decades after his crimes shocked Hong Kong society. The case fundamentally changed how Hong Kong viewed public safety and serial crime. Until Lam, the territory had never dealt with a serial killer, and the investigation exposed significant gaps in forensic capabilities and criminal profiling. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of women using public transportation late at night, leading to increased security measures and public awareness campaigns. What makes these five killers particularly terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how successfully they blended into society while committing acts of unimaginable evil. Gordon Stewart Northcott ran a chicken ranch. Nathaniel Bar-Jonah participated in church youth groups. Wayne Adam Ford worked as a trucker. Francisco de Assis Pereira delivered packages on his motorcycle. Lam Korwan drove a taxi. These weren't the obvious monsters of popular imagination, but ordinary people whose evil was hidden behind mundane occupations and normal appearances. Each case also reveals how systems designed to protect society can fail catastrophically. Bar-Jonah was released despite expressing cannibalistic fantasies to psychiatrists. Ford's crimes might have been prevented if authorities had better communication between jurisdictions. Northcott's operation continued because of family complicity and rural isolation. Pereira exploited the anonymity of urban life to hunt victims. While Lam Korwan was terrorizing Hong Kong, thousands of miles away in Sao Paulo, Brazil, another predator was using his job to hunt for victims. Francisco de Assis Pereira worked as a motorcycle courier, weaving through the chaotic streets of one of South America's largest cities. But his real profession was something far more sinister. Born on November 29, 1967, Francisco grew up in a world of violence and sexual abuse. His aunt molested him repeatedly as a child, creating a twisted fixation on women's bodies that would later manifest in the most horrific ways. As he grew older, forced homosexual relationships instilled in him a paranoid fear of losing his masculinity, his reproductive organs, his very identity as a man. These traumas didn't excuse what he would become, but they helped create a monster. By the 1990s, Francisco was living a double life. During the day, he was just another motoboy, one of thousands of motorcycle couriers racing through Sao Paulo's gridlocked streets, delivering packages and documents. He was polite, efficient, unremarkable, but at night something darker took control. A transvestite he lived with later described brutal beatings, sudden rages, a man who could switch from charming to violent in seconds. Francisco's hunting ground was the state park, a massive 550-hectare forest reserve on Sao Paulo's southern border. This sprawling wilderness, officially called Parque do Estado, was an oasis of green in an urban jungle of concrete and steel. Families came here for picnics, joggers used the trails, couples sought privacy among the trees. It was the perfect place for a predator to disappear with his victims. His method was sickeningly simple. Francisco would approach young women on his motorcycle, often targeting those waiting for buses or walking alone. He was handsome, well-dressed, spoke softly. He would offer them rides, tell them about modeling opportunities, promise them work or money. Many of these women were struggling, desperate for any chance to improve their lives. When a polite man on a motorcycle offered hope, they climbed on. Once they reached the isolated depths of the park, Francisco transformed. The kind stranger vanished, replaced by what he himself called a monster. He would strangle his victims with his bare hands, watching the life drain from their eyes. But death wasn't enough. In acts of grotesque sadism, he would sometimes bite off pieces of their genitalia, literally consuming parts of their bodies while they were still alive. The brutality was beyond comprehension. Francisco later confessed that he had two personalities, a good one and an evil one, and he could feel the evil taking over when he entered the park. He claimed he prayed for strength, begged God to help him resist, but the darkness always won. In twisted moments of self-awareness, he even wished his victims would fight back, would run away, would somehow save themselves from what he was about to do. The killings continued throughout 1997 and into 1998. Francisco's victims were young women with their whole lives ahead of them. There was Selma Ferreira Queiroz, an 18-year-old basketball player whose athletic dreams were cut short. Each woman had a story, a family, friends who loved them. But to Francisco, they were objects to be used and discarded. The case exploded into public consciousness in July 1998 when 4 naked female bodies were discovered in the park over just 3 days. All were found lying face down with their legs spread, a signature that immediately told investigators they were dealing with a serial killer. The victims showed signs of strangulation and sexual assault. Some had been partially burned or mutilated beyond recognition. The discovery sent shockwaves through Sao Paulo. The state park, once a peaceful retreat, became a place of terror. Women stopped jogging alone. Parents kept their daughters closer. The media dubbed the unknown killer, O Maniaco do Parque, the park maniac, and his crimes dominated headlines across Brazil. Police launched a massive investigation, but Francisco was careful. He knew the park intimately, understood where to hide bodies, how to avoid the main trails. He varied his methods, sometimes burning victims to destroy evidence, sometimes leaving them in remote areas where they wouldn't be found for weeks. The investigation seemed to be going nowhere. The break came from an unexpected source. Investigators discovered that one of Francisco's victims, Selma Ferreira Queiroz, had been carrying identification. Her partially burned ID card was found clogged in a toilet at a motorcycle courier company. When police traced the card back to the workplace, they began focusing on employees who had access to that specific bathroom. Francisco knew the net was closing. As his face began appearing on television and in newspapers, he attempted to flee the country. He made it all the way to the Brazil-Uruguay border, somehow passing through multiple police checkpoints, despite being one of the most wanted men in South America. But his luck ran out when he sought shelter with a fisherman who recognized him from TV reports. On August 4th, 1998, Francisco de Assis Pereira was arrested. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. The next day, he led police to the remains of another victim, Isadora Frankel, whose skeleton he had tried to destroy with gasoline, but had only partially burned. During his confessions, Francisco revealed the full scope of his crimes. He admitted to raping and murdering at least 9 women and assaulting 9 others. But even he wasn't sure of the exact number. He told investigators he might have lost count, that the killings had become so routine he couldn't remember every victim. The casual way he discussed taking human lives was almost as chilling as the crimes themselves. The media coverage of Francisco's case sparked intense debate across Brazil. One magazine published his confession quotes on their cover, leading to accusations of sensationalism and exploitation. Critics argued that giving a platform to his twisted thoughts only fed his narcissism and traumatized victims' families further. But the coverage also exposed deeper problems in Brazilian society. The investigation had been plagued by mistakes, jurisdictional disputes, and inadequate resources. Many of Francisco's victims came from poor backgrounds, and some activists argued that if wealthy women had been targeted, the response would have been swifter and more comprehensive. During his trial, Francisco showed no genuine remorse. He spoke about his crimes with clinical detachment, describing the murders as if they were unavoidable natural disasters rather than deliberate acts of evil. He claimed to be tormented by his dual personality, but his detailed planning and careful victim selection revealed a man who was fully in control of his actions. The court wasn't fooled by his attempts to portray himself as a victim of his own mental illness. In a country where the maximum sentence was typically 30 years, Francisco de Assis Pereira received 268 years in prison, ensuring he would never again walk free. The sentence was symbolic as much as practical, a statement that some crimes are so heinous they deserve the harshest possible punishment. Francisco's case fundamentally changed how Brazil viewed serial killers. Before him, such crimes were considered primarily an American or European phenomenon. His arrest shattered that illusion and forced Brazilian law enforcement to develop new investigative techniques and psychological profiles for dealing with serial offenders. The state park slowly returned to normal life, but it was forever changed. Memorials were placed for the victims, and increased security measures were implemented. The name Park Maniac became synonymous with evil in Brazilian culture, a reminder that monsters can hide behind the most ordinary facades. Today, Francisco de Assis Pereira remains locked away in Brazil's prison system, an aging man whose crimes continue to haunt the families of his victims. These 5 cases reveal a disturbing pattern that runs through the darkest corners of human nature. Each killer we've examined operated under a mask of normalcy, blending seamlessly into society while harboring unthinkable evil. But what makes these cases truly terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes. It's how they expose the fundamental vulnerabilities in our communities and the systems designed to protect us. Gordon Stewart Northcott transformed a simple chicken ranch into a house of horrors, exploiting the isolation of rural California and the desperation of families during the Great Depression. His ability to lure children with promises of work and shelter reveals how predators weaponize hope itself. The Wineville chicken coop murders didn't just claim the lives of innocent boys. They shattered the illusion that children were safe in small, tight-knit communities. Northcott's nephew, Sanford Clark, forced to participate in these atrocities, represents another layer of this horror. The killer didn't just destroy his victims, he corrupted those around him, turning family members into unwilling accomplices through fear and manipulation. The case of Walter Collins and his mother Christine's relentless pursuit of truth exposes another chilling reality. When the system fails, when authorities would rather close a case than pursue justice, predators like Northcott thrive in that darkness. Christine Collins faced not just the loss of her son, but a police department that tried to convince her a stranger was her child, simply to avoid admitting their incompetence. Her fight for justice became a battle against institutional corruption, proving that sometimes the monsters wear badges and sit behind desks. Nathaniel Bar Jonah represents perhaps the most disturbing failure of the justice system in our entire list. Here was a man who openly confessed his cannibalistic fantasies to psychiatrists, who had already demonstrated his willingness to harm children, yet was repeatedly released back into society. His transformation from David Paul Brown to Nathaniel Bar Jonah wasn't just a name change. It was a calculated reinvention, allowing him to move from Massachusetts to Montana with a clean slate, carrying his dark urges across state lines like a virus seeking new hosts. The coded journal found in Bar Jonah's home reads like something from the deepest circles of hell. Recipes for cooking human flesh, detailed fantasies of torturing children, thousands of photographs cut from magazines. This wasn't just a killer's collection. It was a manual, a blueprint for unspeakable acts. The fact that neighbors commented on the unusual taste of meat he served at barbecues, meat he claimed was venison, adds a layer of horror that defies comprehension. How many people unknowingly participated in his cannibalistic rituals? How many shared meals that contained the remains of missing children? The disappearance of 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey remains one of the most haunting aspects of Bar Jonah's case. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite the coded confessions, despite the suspicious meat and the bone fragment found in his garage, the murder charges were dropped. Zachary's mother testified that she didn't believe Bar Jonah killed her son, but belief and evidence are different things. Somewhere in Montana, a family continues to live with the uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their child, while the most likely suspect took his secrets to the grave. Wayne Adam Ford's case reveals how modern transportation systems can become hunting grounds for predators. As a long-haul truck driver, Ford had access to highways spanning multiple states, anonymous motels, and isolated truck stops where vulnerable women sought rides or money. His victims were often sex workers or women desperate enough to accept help from a stranger. Society's tendency to overlook these marginalized women gave Ford a hunting ground where disappearances went unnoticed for months or even years. The moment Ford walked into that sheriff's department with a severed breast in his jacket pocket represents one of the most surreal surrenders in criminal history. This wasn't remorse. This was a man who recognized he had lost control of his compulsions and feared what he might do next. His confession revealed a chilling self-awareness. He knew he was a monster, understood the horror of his actions, yet felt powerless to stop. The survivor who testified about being bound, raped, and strangled before inexplicably being released provides a glimpse into Ford's psychology. He wasn't just killing for convenience or to eliminate witnesses. The suffering itself was the point. The terror in their eyes, the struggle for breath, the moment when life left their bodies, this was what he craved. The 25-year identification of Carrie Ann Cummings through DNA technology reminds us that these weren't just victims. They were daughters, sisters, friends who were loved and missed. For a quarter century, she existed only as Jane Doe, a collection of bones and forensic evidence. The advancement of genetic genealogy finally gave her back her name, but it also highlighted how many victims remain unidentified, how many families continue waiting for answers that may never come. Francisco de Assis. Pereira's reign of terror in São Paulo demonstrates how urban environments can provide both hunting grounds and hiding places for serial killers. The sprawling state park became his personal killing field, a 550-hectare forest where screams would go unheard and bodies could decompose in silence. His day job as a motorcycle courier gave him intimate knowledge of the city's layout, the ability to move quickly through traffic, and a legitimate reason to be anywhere at any time. The discovery of 4 naked bodies in 3 days marked a turning point in the investigation, but it also revealed how many women had already vanished without anyone connecting the dots. Pereira's claim that he might have lost count of his victims suggests the true scope of his crimes may never be known. Each woman he approached trusted him enough to accept a ride. They saw a working man, a courier just trying to make a living, not realizing they were climbing onto a vehicle that would carry them to their deaths. The detail about Pereira biting off pieces of his victim's vulva reveals a level of sadistic brutality that goes beyond murder. This wasn't killing for convenience or even sexual gratification. This was ritualistic mutilation, a signature that marked his territory and satisfied some twisted psychological need. His confession about having both good and bad personalities, his claims that he prayed but couldn't resist his dark side, paint the picture of a man at war with himself. But that internal struggle never translated into mercy for his victims. The media's handling of Pereira's case, including the controversial magazine cover featuring his confessions, exposed another dimension of these crimes. Serial killers become celebrities, their words dissected and analyzed, their faces plastered across newspapers and television screens. This sensationalism serves the public's morbid curiosity, but often comes at the expense of the victim's dignity and their family's privacy. The killers achieve a form of immortality through infamy, while their victims risk being reduced to mere plot points in a larger narrative. Lam Kor Wan's story from Hong Kong reveals how cultural and geographical factors can influence both the methods killers use and the way society responds to their crimes. As Hong Kong's first recorded serial killer, Lam operated in a society unprepared for such systematic brutality. His use of a taxi gave him access to women who were alone and vulnerable, particularly during rainy evenings when visibility was poor and fewer people were on the streets. The discovery of his photographic collection represents one of the most disturbing aspects of his case. Lam didn't just kill and dismember his victims. He documented every step of the process, creating a visual library of his crimes. These weren't candid snapshots or hurried Polaroids. These were carefully composed photographs, filmed operations that he treated like artistic projects. The fact that he attempted to develop these photos at a commercial shop demonstrates either stunning arrogance or complete disconnect from reality. Did he truly believe no one would question photographs of dismembered bodies and acts of necrophilia? The preservation of body parts in Tupperware containers filled with formaldehyde shows a level of preparation and planning that belies any claim of crimes of passion. Lam had transformed his family home into a makeshift morgue and laboratory, conducting his gruesome experiments while his parents and brother slept nearby. The surgical precision of his dismemberments, the careful preservation of organs, the methodical documentation, all point to someone who found genuine pleasure in the process of death and decay. His confession to eating part of a victim's intestine, combined with his claim that God told him to kill, reveals the complex delusions that often accompany such extreme violence. Whether these religious justifications were genuine beliefs or convenient excuses, they allowed Lamb to compartmentalize his actions, to see himself as an instrument of divine will rather than a predator feeding his own twisted desires. What unites all five of these killers is their ability to exploit trust. Northcott offered employment to desperate families. Bar Jonah posed as a police officer, a figure children are taught to trust. Ford presented himself as a helpful truck driver, offering rides to stranded women. Pereira's was just a working man with a motorcycle, offering transportation through the city. Lam was a taxi driver, someone people pay to take them safely home. Each killer weaponized the basic human need to trust others, turning our social bonds into tools of predation. These cases also reveal the importance of listening to those who are often overlooked. Christine Collins' refusal to accept the wrong child led to the exposure of the Wineville murders. The photo technician who reported Lamb's disturbing photographs prevented who knows how many additional deaths. Ford's brother encouraged him to surrender, potentially saving future victims. Sometimes the difference between a killer continuing their spree and being stopped comes down to one person willing to speak up, to trust their instincts, to risk being wrong in service of potentially being right. The geographical spread of these crimes, from rural California to urban Hong Kong, from the highways of the American West to the parks of Sao Paulo, demonstrates that this kind of evil isn't confined to any particular culture, economic system, or social structure. These killers emerged from vastly different backgrounds and operated in completely different environments, yet their methods and motivations show disturbing similarities. They all targeted the vulnerable. They all used positions of apparent normalcy to gain access to victims. They all found ways to dispose of evidence and delay discovery. Most chillingly, they all continued killing until external forces stopped them. The technological aspects of these cases also deserve attention. Bar Jonah's coded journal required FBI expertise to decode, revealing how killers adapt to avoid detection. Ford's crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions, complicating investigations in an era before modern databases and communication systems. Pereira's use of a motorcycle allowed him to navigate Sao Paulo's traffic in ways that would have been impossible in a car. Lamb's photographic documentation created evidence that ultimately led to his capture, showing how killers' compulsions can become their downfall. But perhaps the most disturbing common thread is how long each killer operated before being caught. Northcott's ranch became a killing ground for years before Sanford Clark's escape led to the investigation. Bar Jonah molested and potentially killed children across multiple states over decades. Ford traveled the highways for months, leaving bodies scattered across California. Pereira terrorized Sao Paulo for over a year. Lam murdered at least 4 women before a photo technician's suspicions ended his spree. In each case, the killer had time to refine their methods, to grow bolder, to claim more victims. The gap between their first kill and their capture represents not just investigative challenges, but human lives that could have been saved. These 5 killers also demonstrate the evolution of criminal investigation techniques. Northcott was caught through traditional detective work and witness testimony. Bar Jonah's coded writings required federal expertise to decode. Ford's case involved early DNA evidence and multi-jurisdictional cooperation. Pereira was identified through media coverage and public tips. Lamb was caught when commercial photo processing revealed his crimes. Each case pushed law enforcement to develop new techniques, to think in new ways about how predators operate and how they can be stopped. The aftermath of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. Families were destroyed, communities were traumatized, and entire regions became associated with unthinkable horror. Wineville changed its name to escape the shadow of Northcott's crimes. Mothers in Montana feared letting their children out of sight after Bar Jonah's activities became known. Truck stops and highways took on new menace after Ford's confession. São Paulo's parks became places of fear rather than recreation. Hong Kong had to confront the reality that such monsters could emerge from their own society. Yet these cases also reveal the resilience of human nature and the power of justice, however delayed. Christine Collins never stopped fighting for the truth about her son. Families of Ford's victims found some measure of closure when he was finally brought to trial. The capture of each killer represented not just the end of their spree, but a victory for those who refused to give up, who continued investigating, who kept asking questions when others wanted to move on. The 5 killers we've examined represent some of the darkest chapters in criminal history, but they also serve as reminders of why we must remain vigilant, why we must listen to those who are vulnerable, and why we must never assume that evil announces itself clearly. These monsters walked among us, worked alongside us, lived in our communities, and preyed on our trust. Understanding their methods, their psychology, and their impact isn't about glorifying their crimes. It's about learning to recognize the warning signs, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that their victims are never forgotten. In examining these 5 cases, we've seen how evil can wear 1,000 faces, how it can adapt to any environment, and how it can exploit our most basic human instincts. But we've also seen how ordinary people, through courage, persistence, and simple human decency, can bring even the most cunning predators to justice. As we've journeyed through the twisted minds and heinous acts of these 5 killers, we've witnessed how evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. From Northcott's rural chicken ranch to Bar Jonah's community involvement, from Ford's truck cab to Pereira's motorcycle courier routes, and finally to Lamb's taxi in the neon-lit streets of Hong Kong, each of these predators exploited the very systems designed to protect and serve society. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how they reveal the frightening ease with which dangerous individuals can blend into our communities. Northcott presented himself as a businessman running a legitimate ranch. Bar Jonah actively participated in Christian fellowship groups, using his perceived righteousness as a hunting ground. Ford used his profession as a trucker to access vulnerable women across state lines. Pereira's job as a motorcycle courier gave him mobility and access to potential victims throughout São Paulo. Lamb's taxi provided the perfect mobile crime scene, with victims willingly entering what they believed was safe transportation. These killers didn't operate in isolation. They thrived because of systemic failures that allowed them to continue their sprees far longer than should have been possible. Northcott's remote location provided the perfect cover for his crimes, while corrupt or incompetent law enforcement initially bungled investigations. Bar Jonah's case represents perhaps the most egregious failure of the justice system, where a judge deemed him not dangerous despite his documented fantasies of murdering and eating children. Ford's crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions, complicating investigations and allowing him to continue killing. Pereira exploited the urban anonymity of Sao Paulo, while Lam's nocturnal schedule and the privacy of his family apartment created the perfect conditions for his horrific activities. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that continue to challenge our understanding of criminal behavior. Each demonstrated a level of organization and planning that contradicts the popular image of serial killers as disorganized madmen. Northcott's systematic abuse and murder of children, Bar Jonah's coded journals and recipe collections, Ford's methodical dismemberment and disposal techniques, Pereira's careful selection of hunting grounds, and Lam's documentation of his crimes through photographs and videos all point to calculated, deliberate actions rather than impulsive violence. Perhaps most disturbing is how these killers managed to maintain their public personas while committing their crimes. Northcott ran a business and employed local workers. Bar Jonah participated in community religious activities. Ford worked steadily as a truck driver. Pereira maintained employment as a courier. Lam lived with his family and worked regular shifts. This duality challenges our assumptions about how evil manifests in society and reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal. The investigation and capture of these killers also highlight both the limitations and the evolution of law enforcement techniques. The Northcott case relied heavily on witness testimony from an abused child, while modern DNA evidence played crucial roles in the Ford case. Photographic evidence proved critical in capturing Lam, while Bar Jonah's coded writings required FBI expertise to decode. Each case contributed to our understanding of criminal investigation and the importance of taking seriously even the most disturbing confessions and evidence. The victims in these cases represent some of society's most vulnerable populations: children drawn to employment opportunities, women working in sex trade, hitchhikers seeking transportation, young women accepting rides, and late-night taxi passengers all found themselves prey to these predators. Their stories remind us that evil often targets those with the fewest resources and the least societal protection. What's particularly haunting about these cases is how they might have been prevented. Earlier intervention in Northcott's case could have saved multiple young lives. Proper risk assessment of Bar Jonah's clear and documented threats could have prevented his release and subsequent crimes. Better communication between law enforcement agencies might have stopped Ford sooner. Improved security measures in public spaces could have protected Pereira's victims. More thorough background checks for taxi drivers might have identified Lam's potential for violence. These cases also demonstrate the critical importance of believing victims and witnesses, particularly children and marginalized individuals whose testimony might otherwise be dismissed. Sanford Clark's eventual testimony was crucial in the Northcott case, while survivor accounts provided vital evidence against Ford. The courage of those who came forward, often at great personal risk, ultimately led to justice for the victims. The impact of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Entire communities were traumatized by these killings. Wineville changed its name to escape the shadow of Northcott's crimes. Families across multiple states lived in fear during Ford's spree. São Paulo's residents altered their behavior and routines in response to Pereira's attacks. Hong Kong's sense of urban safety was forever changed by Lam's killing spree. Yet these cases also reveal the resilience of the human spirit and the power of persistence in seeking justice. Christine Collins's relentless search for her son Walter brought national attention to the Wineville murders. Zachary Ramsey's family never gave up hope for answers about their son's disappearance. The families of Ford's victims fought for recognition and justice. The communities affected by Pereira's crimes came together to support survivors and remember victims. Hong Kong's law enforcement learned valuable lessons that improved their ability to investigate similar crimes. As we conclude this examination of these 5 rarely discussed but profoundly disturbing serial killers, we're left with uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and our society's ability to protect its most vulnerable members. These cases remind us that vigilance is not paranoia, that taking threats seriously can save lives, and that the price of ignoring warning signs is often paid in innocent blood. The stories of Gordon Stewart Northcott, Nathaniel Barjona, Wayne Adam Ford, Francisco de Assis Pereira, and Lam Korwan serve as dark reminders of humanity's capacity for evil, but they also highlight our capacity for justice, resilience, and the determination to ensure that the victims of these horrific crimes are never forgotten. As we reach the end of our disturbing journey through the crimes of these 5 forgotten monsters, we're left with profound questions about the nature of evil itself. Gordon Stewart Northcott, Nathaniel Barjona, Wayne Adam Ford, Francisco de Assis Pereira, and Lam Korwan didn't emerge from the shadows of society. They walked among us, worked alongside us, and in some cases, even served us. They were the ranch owner offering employment, the community member attending church fellowship, the truck driver on the highway, the motorcycle courier delivering packages, and the taxi driver providing rides home. Their ability to blend seamlessly into ordinary life while harboring such darkness reveals something deeply unsettling about the human condition. What makes these cases particularly chilling is how each killer exploited the fundamental trust that holds society together. Northcott preyed on desperate families seeking work for their children during the Great Depression. Barjona infiltrated youth groups and posed as a police officer, corrupting symbols of safety and guidance. Ford targeted the most vulnerable women, those society often overlooks. Pereira used his legitimate job as a motorcycle courier to gain access to victims. Lam turned the simple act of taking a taxi ride into a death sentence. They didn't just kill individuals, they shattered the basic assumptions we make about safety in our daily lives. The methodical nature of their crimes is equally disturbing. These weren't crimes of passion or spontaneous violence. Northcott carefully constructed his chicken ranch as a killing ground, complete with quicklime for disposing of evidence. Barjona kept coded journals with recipes for human flesh and maintained thousands of photographs of potential victims. Ford traveled methodically across state lines, using his knowledge of trucking routes to dispose of bodies. Pereira selected isolated locations in the state park for maximum concealment. Lam documented his atrocities with photographs and videos, treating murder like a professional project. The level of planning, the attention to detail, the cold calculation required for such systematic brutality challenges our understanding of human psychology. Perhaps most horrifying is how these killers manage to maintain their double lives for extended periods. Northcott operated his ranch of horrors for years while presenting himself as a legitimate businessman. Bar Jonah continued his predatory behavior despite multiple arrests and even psychiatric evaluations that revealed his cannibalistic fantasies. Ford drove the highways of America for months, picking up victims while maintaining relationships with family and friends. Pereira worked his regular job by day while prowling Sao Paulo's parks by night. Lam lived with his family, who remained completely unaware that their son and brother was dismembering bodies in the next room. The compartmentalization required to maintain such extreme deception speaks to a level of psychological sophistication that makes these crimes even more disturbing. The investigation and capture of these killers also reveals how much criminal investigation has evolved over the decades. Northcott's case relied heavily on witness testimony and physical evidence found at his ranch. Bar Jonah's coded journals required FBI cryptographers to decode his twisted fantasies. Ford's case involved early DNA evidence and multi-state coordination. Pereira was caught through media publicity and public recognition. Lam's capture came through the sharp eyes of a photo technician who recognized something wasn't right. Each case pushed the boundaries of investigative techniques and highlighted the importance of public vigilance and interagency cooperation. The legal outcomes of these cases also tell a story about justice and society's response to extreme evil. Northcott was executed in 1930, his death reportedly taking 13 agonizing minutes due to a failed hanging. Bar Jonah died in prison of natural causes, taking his secrets to the grave. Ford sits on death row, his execution delayed by California's moratorium on capital punishment. Pereira received 268 years in prison, ensuring he'll never see freedom again. Lam's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he remains behind bars decades later. The varying sentences reflect different legal systems, different eras, and different societal approaches to ultimate punishment. But justice for the perpetrators doesn't erase the lasting damage to victims, families, and communities. The families of Northcott's victims fought for decades to have their children's disappearances acknowledged and investigated. Bar Jonah's suspected victims may never be identified or recovered. Ford's victims were scattered across multiple states, some remaining unidentified for decades. Pereira's attacks terrorized Sao Paulo's female population and changed how women navigated the city. Lam's crimes shattered Hong Kong's sense of security and innocence. The ripple effects of these crimes extend far beyond the immediate victims, touching entire communities and changing how people interact with the world around them. These cases also highlight systemic failures that allowed these killers to operate for extended periods. Northcott exploited an era when missing children from poor families received little attention from authorities. Bar Jonah benefited from a criminal justice system that repeatedly failed to recognize the danger he posed, despite clear warning signs. Ford targeted women from marginalized communities whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. Pereira operated in a sprawling urban environment where coordination between different police jurisdictions was challenging. Lam exploited the anonymity of city life and the trust people placed in taxi drivers. Each case reveals gaps in social protection systems that predators learned to exploit. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing commonalities. Most experienced childhood trauma or abuse that seemed to twist their development in fundamental ways. They demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize their actions and maintain facades of normalcy. They showed a complete lack of empathy for their victims, viewing them as objects rather than human beings. They often escalated their crimes over time, becoming more bold and sadistic. They demonstrated a compulsive need to control and dominate their victims completely. Understanding these patterns is crucial for identifying potential killers before they can claim victims, though the challenge remains that many people experience trauma without becoming killers, making prediction extremely difficult. The media coverage of these cases also shaped public perception, and in some instances, influenced the investigations themselves. Northcott's crimes became a national sensation, leading to increased scrutiny of child welfare systems. Bar Jonah's case highlighted the failures of psychiatric evaluation and release procedures. Ford's self-surrender created a media frenzy about the psychology of serial killers. Pereira's case led to debates about sensationalist media coverage and its impact on public safety. Lam's crimes shocked Hong Kong society and challenged assumptions about urban safety. The way these stories were told and retold in media influenced public policy, investigative procedures, and social attitudes toward crime and punishment. As we conclude this examination of forgotten evil, we're reminded that the capacity for both tremendous good and unspeakable evil exists within humanity. These 5 killers represent the darkest possibilities of human nature, but their capture and conviction also demonstrate humanity's capacity for justice, investigation, and the protection of the innocent. The police officers who refused to give up on cold cases, the witnesses who came forward despite personal risk, the forensic specialists who pieced together evidence from scattered remains, the families who never stopped seeking answers, all represent the better angels of human nature responding to its darkest impulses. The stories of Gordon Stewart Northcott, Nathaniel Bar Jonah, Wayne Adam Ford, Francisco de Assi Pereira, and Lam Korwan serve as stark reminders that evil often wears an ordinary face. They challenge us to remain vigilant, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, to speak up when we witness concerning behavior, and to support systems that protect the vulnerable. Most importantly, they remind us that behind every statistic, every case file, every news report, there were real people with real lives who deserved so much better than the fate these monsters imposed upon them. Their memory demands that we never forget, never become complacent, and never stop working to build a world where such predators cannot thrive in the shadows of our communities.